a refresher, so we go back to it. Where our class, of course, is Jewish concepts of war. And in order to learn Jewish concepts of war, it's also important to understand the context of everything. There are things we're going to be learning in the next week or two or three that are quite not Western and not the way we practice Judaism as Orthodox Jews even today. Things that existed then that for a whole bunch of reasons no longer are applicable. And we're not going to avoid what's in the text. We're going to confront the text, learn the text, understand its context, and go from there. So it's important to have the foundation of where it all comes from. Jewish concepts of war begin in times that we had kings. And kings had extraordinary power and extraordinary authority. And Judaism, simply in the early foundational periods, cannot be placed in the context of Western civilization. Today, we like to speak about how Judaism is a modern Western, modern way of living. We're not medieval, let's say, like the Islamists, like the Hamas, and frankly, all of the Islamists. We like to point out that Christianity and Judaism are a whole modern world apart from these barbarians from the Middle Ages. It's important to understand that there are, and I think, and those of us who know our Torah very well, know that there are things in the Torah that do not at all, there's no two ways about it, they're just not modern. And I'm not going to come back and say, well, it's not modern, but that's the way we do it. It's not the way we do it. It's not modern, and it's not the way we do it. As Orthodox Jews, I mean, for a Reform rabbi to say it's not the way we do it, well, that's everything. Keeping Shabbat, well, that's not the way we do it. Keeping kosher, that's not the way we do it. You don't eat pork, that's not the way we do it. But I'm Orthodox, where we keep the laws, there are things in the Torah that, for a whole bunch of different reasons, ranging from that the oral law teaches it is not to be taken exactly as written in the written law. There's also the oral law. And there are the poskim, the rabbis of the different generations, who interpret in each generation how the law applies. So people go in every generation to their rabbis, their poskim, and they ask for a psak din. They ask, what's the halacha? How do we do it today? And sometimes they're told, well, this might say this in the Chumash, but that's not the way you cannot practice your Judaism just by being self-taught. And that's part of the reason there is an oral law, to teach us that Judaism is not simply the written word. The written word is part of the foundation of Judaism, but it is not all of Judaism. And woe unto a Jew who tries to practice his or her Judaism simply self-taught, living in Antarctica with a copy of the Bible, albeit the Old Testament, albeit just the Jewish Tanakh. It's still not going to be Judaism. That says an eye for an eye. Yet Judaism never took an eye for an eye. And I could just go on and on and on with a gazillion examples like that we don't take literally as it's written in the text. And that's we, the Orthodox. So it's important to understand the foundations so that I can explain to you some of the things that do come up that we simply don't do. And then on the other hand, we do have Amalek. And there's no two ways about it. And we don't defend it. We don't apologize for it. Amalek must be exterminated, eradicated completely from the face of the earth. Now, it happens to be, we don't know who they are. So sure, the Republic of South Africa can bring a case before the International Court of Justice and quote President Herzog and the Prime Minister Netanyahu, who spoke about that we're going to go after Hamas like they're Amalek. And next thing you know, you got South Africa coming and saying, look, it's genocide. They're quoting their Bible to wipe out it's not genocide. It's figurative because we don't know who Amalek is. We don't know. Amalek, for those of us who are studied, Amalek is like a DNA thing. It's like, do you come from Amalek? Do you come from Esav? And we went through it in the text, how ultimately, like Esav's grandchild was a guy named Amalek, and he's the progenitor of a people named Amalek. He was born through the concubine Timnah. We went through all of that. So we who understand what's going on, because you need context. If you don't have context, you don't. Where are you going to go? You're going to go to the International Court of Justice in The Hague, and you're going to start holding a shiur? You're going to teach them Gemara? It doesn't pay. Besides, they're not listening. They've already made up their minds before they even walked into the courtroom. So we're going to go back to Shmuel. And for those of you in Tuesday night class, where it just so happens we've been learning Shmuel Aleph long before October 7 was on the horizon. So we're going to look back at chapter 8. We'll start with a refresher. We've learned it before. It's going to be a refresher on something we learned previously. Chapter 8. The prophet Samuel was the great prophet of the generation. He was the prophet, and he was also the political leader. He was the head of government, so to speak, the head of state, so to speak. There was no king. That's why it's the book of Shmuel, not the book of Malachim. It's the book of Samuel, not the book of Kings. There were no kings. There was no King Saul, who was the first king. Samuel, Shmuel, at his retirement, was called upon by God to anoint the first king. And now Shmuel is at the end of his career as the public prophet, and the nation is saying, you're about to retire, and your sons are not worthy to continue in your footsteps. Consequently, it's now time to invoke a mitzvah in the Torah, the 5 books of Moses, the Chumash, the Torah, Sefer Devarim, the book of Deuteronomy, where HaKadosh Baruch Hu, God said, when you will come into the land of Israel, the promised land, and you will name a king, you will say it's time to name a king, and then there's halachas about a king, that he should not have too many wives, he should not have too many horses, he should not lead the people back into Egypt. There are certain halachot about the king of Israel, and the Torah tells us. So now the people are saying to Shmuel, we're ready. It's time for a king. And he's bothered by it. And our rabbis tell us he wasn't bothered by their invoking a mitzvah in the Torah, that the time has come to invoke the Torah's mitzvah that in the land of Israel he could have a king. He was bothered by what motivated them. That's the key. Do you want a king because God Almighty said when you come into the land of Israel you should name for yourselves a king? That's good. Or do you want a king because you want to be like all the nations around you? That's bad. If the whole idea is you want to be like America and you want to be like France and you want to be, okay, they didn't have those countries then. I'm using examples. But for Jews to decide today, for a Jew to come and say, we wish our Judaism would be like, that we would have the values of America and of France and of England, not to mention Red China and the Soviet Union, or now it's called People's Republic of China, and Russia, and Iran, or any dictatorship, or half the dictatorships in South America, you know, or good countries like America and France, and to come and say, I wish we Jews had the values of Western. That's wrong. Actually, Judaism acknowledges we're not exactly toe-to-toe in step with Western civilization. And it's very hard to explain it because we don't control the media. And this is not even about liberal, conservative, Republican, Democrat. We don't control the media. And the mass media and mass education and the universities, it's very hard. It's challenging as an Orthodox rabbi teaching the truth. And what we in the Orthodox world do is we treat the Torah as a compass. That tells us where north is, right? That's what a compass is. You know, you can always count on a good compass pointing north. And from there, you can find your way back. because your compass always points north. The Torah always points truth. And an Orthodox rabbi never deviates from that compass. And there are times and generations like the current one where it's harder to be an Orthodox rabbi because we are against the grain. And so be it. But a true Orthodox rabbi, you try to explain it and you provide context. And that's what these classes do. I try to present truth and context. But we don't change Orthodox, we don't change the truth. And you know what ends up happening? It's kind of interesting. You find over time, Reform always is racing, keep in step with the Western world. They are the ones in touch and step with the Western world. They are the ones lambasting Orthodoxy as antediluvian, like we are from before the flood. That they're the ones that are marching with the test of history. They're in step with history. And yet, if you look, just the opposite. You can't argue that. When you get into a debate, I get on a panel with a Reform rabbi, and the rabbi says, "You're not in touch. You're not in step with history." How do you answer that? The only way to prove they're wrong is for history to unfold. I'll answer you 100 years from now. How can you say to me in 2024, what answer can I give to someone who in 2024 says, Rabbi Fischer, you are not in step with history? That's impossible. So what I can do is I can point to 100 years ago and tell you things that were said 100 years ago when they said Orthodoxy is out of step with history. All right. So they abandoned Zionism. Germany is our Zion. Berlin is our Jerusalem. And the Orthodox, you're still praying for Israel. You're out of touch with history. Well, it's 100 years later. We were in step with history. They abandoned the Hebrew language. They took on German. They changed their Saturday prayers to pray in German, to pray in the vernacular. Hebrew, you're out of touch. You're not in step with history. How do you answer that? 100 years later, even Reformed temples, it's no longer simply called a confirmation. They now use the word b'nai mitzvah. They talk Hebrew again. They stopped wearing yarmulkes. Now, I went to a meeting of the Orange County Board of Rabbis. It's an experience. I love them. They're my bros. They're my sisters. I'm the only Orthodox rabbi that attends their meetings. The rest of them are Reform and conservative. There are 2 or 3 other Orthodox rabbis in town, and they don't attend the meetings. Well, they show up, but they're not members. I'm the only one who's a member. Peoplehood. Do you know, I go into a meeting of the Orange County Board of Rabbis. Half the rabbis are wearing yarmulkes, half aren't. So I'm going to ask you, can you guess which half of the rabbis at the Orange County Board of Rabbis wear yarmulkes, which don't? So you're going to say, I know, the conservative rabbis are the ones that wear the yarmulkes, and the Reform rabbis don't. Wrong. The male rabbis don't wear the yarmulkes. The female rabbis wear the yarmulkes. That's what I'm dealing with. That's what we're dealing with. Okay? You want to go to the bonus round? So, in the same context, in marching in touch with history, it's tough to be an Orthodox rabbi today because only 100 years from now, in the year 2124, if Mashiach hasn't come already, will rabbis be able to say that the Lubavitchers and the modern Orthodoxers and the Agudists, they were in touch with history when they said abortion on demand is wrong. It's very hard to take that position in the public sphere. If a mother's life is in danger, absolutely, of course. And certain other questions that I can't go into now. It's a whole series of 10 classes. But abortion on demand, our bodies ourselves? No, that's not Judaism. Judaism says the body belongs to God. The body belongs to God. The body does not belong to you. It goes against Western civilization. Okay, I can't help it. Only with abortion? No, with everything. I'll give you an example. Has nothing to do with abortion. A Jew is not allowed to leave in his or her last will or otherwise tell the kids they want to be cremated. Not allowed to be cremated. It's not your body. It's on loan from God. The body belongs to God. He said you cannot cremate it. So you don't have that option. But what about my rights? You don't have the rights. My body, our bodies ourselves, you don't have the right. What about my freedoms? What about my democracies? That's not Judaism. Another example. I want to get a nice big tattoo. I want a nice big tattoo that says, I love mom. Can't do it. But what better way to honor my mother than to put a big tattoo right on my left arm, I love mom, and on the right arm, I'm terrified of dad. That to fear father and love honor mother. Not allowed to do it. Torah says no tattoos. It doesn't go like curb your enthusiasm. Doesn't mean you can't get buried in a Jewish cemetery. That's Larry David Mishigas. But not allowed to do it. Your body does not belong to you. Our bodies ourselves doesn't belong to you. Who came up with such a crazy idea? Judaism, the Torah. So it's very hard to be an Orthodox rabbi. You think it's just hard to remember who to thank for the Kiddush on Saturday? That's a big thing. You go ahead and do a world-class sermon, and you just knock it out of the ballpark, and you have people crying in shul, and non-Jews who are visiting throwing their arms in the I believe, I want to join. Afterwards, you're feeling really good. Today I was a good rabbi. And you find out that the board is up in arms, the board of directors, an emergency meeting because the rabbi forgot to announce that Mrs. Schwartzbergstein-owitz is the sponsor of Kiddush in honor of her cat. And the rabbi forgot to make the announcement, and now there's a search committee for a new rabbi because that's the first requirement of every congregation. Don't forget to announce who sponsored the Kiddush. So, all right, you didn't come from my rant. It has to be said. Sometimes things have to be said. And it has to be explained why we're going to go back to Shmuel, chapter 8, Shmuel Aleph. Here we go. He got up and he's retiring. And the reason I got into the rant is that it was thoroughly appropriate for the Jewish people to say, we want a king. The Torah says you're entitled and should have one. But it was the motivation. Why do you do things? Why do you observe Judaism? Why do you do the mitzvah? The mitzvah must be because you want to serve God, as his Torah commands, and not because you want to be like America, or you want to be like France, or in those days you want to be like Canaan and like the other surrounding nations, Ammon, Edom, Moab. This idea that we want to be like the nations around us is the opposite of what Judaism is. So they came with the wrong motivation. You, Shmuel Hanavi, Samuel the prophet are retiring, and your sons are not, they're not really right for continuing into in your footsteps, and we really don't feel great telling you this. It's very hard to say. And so the Torah has a solution, a remedy to have a king. And if they would have said it that way, that would be great. But instead they come and they say, now that you're retiring, we want to be like all the other nations around us. We don't want to be led by a prophet. We want to be led by a king, like everyone else. And that's where they went wrong. But regardless, Shmuel now says to God, I'm really disappointed. And God says, don't be upset because it's not you they're really rejecting, it's I. All right. So let's refresh our memory to chapter 8, because it's in here that we have the foundation of what the king of Israel is, the king who's going to take us to war, and the authority he has to take us to war. So, Vayirad Ababianei Shmuel, it was displeasing to Shmuel when the people said, give us a king to govern us. To Nolonu melech l'shaftenu. He prayed to God, and God said, actually, Shma b'kol ha'am. Do what the people are asking for, as they're asking, ki lo otchama asu, ki otima asu mimlach aleim. It is not you that the people are rejecting, it is I whom they're rejecting as their king. Right? God is the king. Hashem melech, Hashem malach, Hashem yimloch. God is the melech. And so it goes on. So God says, Atah with an ayin, meaning now, Atah shma b'kolam. So now hearken unto what they're asking, accept it. But warn them, do them the favor of just one last time before they get the king, because when they get a king, there's no turning back. They can't come later and say, oops, could we go back to prophecy and prophets? Sorry, no more prophets, your loss. Now you've got a king. So give them the warning. So Shmuel says, this is that there's no way, I can't help, whenever I highlight for you text, it automatically jumps to the right column as well. And either I could X that out or not, so I'm just going to leave it there for now. This is what the practice of the king will be. You want a king? It's like H.L. Mencken said about democracy, and I get it a little bit wrong, but basically H.L. Mencken said about democracy that democracy is the philosophy of government that says the people know what they want, and they deserve to get it good and hard. And that's what essentially Shmuel is telling them. You want a king? Here's what a king is. And if that's what you want, you'll get it good and hard. Here's what's going to be. He's going to take your sons and appoint them as his charioteers. A king needs to have people, not just one guy riding his chariot like Uber. A king needs to have a whole fancy thing like they have in those grand spectacle movies like Ben-Hur. Okay, and stuff like that. Lots and lots of chariots, or like Cecil B. DeMille's 10 Commandments, where Yul Brynner has all these chariots all around him. And he's going to need horsemen, and he's going to take your sons, your kid wants to be like a doctor, a lawyer. In those days, I don't know, a blacksmith, a whitesmith, and he's just going to grab your kids. He'll just have a couple of strong guys from his army coming at your door. We understand you have a 19-year-old son named Chaim. The king spotted him. He's tall and strapping, and the king hereby drafts him as a king's charioteer. And that's it. No, that's what you're getting. You want kings? He'll appoint them as chiefs of his thousands and his 50s. Or they'll have to plow his fields. King is going to have farms. He's going to have large, large fields. And who's going to work the fields? The king is he'll have people from the surrounding nations that come to live under Israel's sovereignty. And he'll pull your kids also to reap his harvest, make his weapons. He'll make your son a blacksmith. Your kid wants to be playing a harp. Okay, well, the king wants him for the blacksmith. And he'll take your daughters. Your daughter hopes to just get married and raise a family, whatever they do in those days. In those days, it wasn't like today, or even like the 50s, where a woman would be a secretary and a bookkeeper. In those days, he'll take your girls to be his perfumers, to to make perfume, I don't know, to cook. If you've ever seen Upstairs, Downstairs, back in the old days, I'm dating myself, public TV, and then they made it all over again. They gave it a new name, Downton Abbey, changed it a little. Gives you a little bit of an idea. And that's not even the king. That's not even Buckingham Palace. That's just the lords and the ladies of England, where they've got all those people working downstairs, and they're never going to be able to make it upstairs. If you ever saw Downton Abbey or Upstairs, Downstairs, that's a whole different group of society. And their dream is one day to be like the headmistress downstairs, or to be the number one butler. They don't even dare to dream, or like their dream is one day to be a butler in charge of their own underlings at another house. They don't even dare to dream to be upstairs. So that's what he's going to do with your kids. They'll be cooking and baking for him. And he'll seize your best fields for himself, and your vineyards, and your olive groves. And not only for himself, he's going to give them la'avadav, because I don't know what courtier means. They're going to give them to people who work in his court, for his servants, his highest ranking servants. They'll remain servants, but as a reward, he'll say to him, you've been my servant 10 years, very loyal. I'm going to give you a vineyard. And he'll seize some other guy's. You want a king? He'll seize your vineyard to give it to a servant. He'll take a 10th part of your grain and give it to his eunuchs and courtiers. Again, his avadim. He'll take your male and female slaves. That is, under Jewish law, there was an Eved Ivri, a Shivcha, an Ama Ivriya, a Hebrew manservant, a Hebrew woman servant. Don't have time to get into all of that now and all those fine points. We did it once. We'll have a class like that one of these days again for our new generation of students. But he'll take he'll take your male and female servants, choice young men. He'll put them to work for him. So there you have 10 servants or 3 servants, and he'll decide one of them is a superstar. He'll steal them from you. You have no say. He'll take a 10th part of your sheep and he'll take a 10 tiulol avadim. He'll even make you his servants. The day will come when you cry out because of the king you chose. And the Lord will not answer you on that day. Uza'aktem. You know where we see the word za'ak? Za'ak. That was what the people of Sodom did when they cried out to God Almighty. Right before God rained fire and brimstone on Sodom and Gomorrah. Sodom va'amorah, Sodom and Gomorrah. It says that they cried out with that verb. That's the verb that the Torah says that the Jews cried out from their slavery in Egypt, praying to God to save us from Egyptian slavery. That's what finally broke the ice and led God to have Moshe Rabbeinu come and confront Pharaoh and say, let my people go to serve me, or along came the 10 plagues and the Yetziat Mitzrayim. That's not just crying. That is some kind of crying out. The kind of crying out that finally prompted God to rain fire and brimstone on Sodom and Gomorrah and to bring the Jews out of Egypt. That's the kind of crying out you're going to be doing. Only whereas his response to that level of crying out was fire and brimstone and was the 10 plagues, here, nothing's going to save you. Lord will not answer you. Once you have a king, that's your form of government. He's not going to shift it into democracy. He's not going to shift it into some other form of government. The people wouldn't listen. Vayama'anu Hashem, vayama'anu ha'am, lishmoa b'kol Shmuel. The people refused to hear Shmuel's warning, his voice, and they said, no, we want a king. Lo ki imelech ihi aleinu. No, we must have a king. Okay, And here again, if you were wondering, Rabbi, where exactly did they say they want a king like all the other nations? Like that, how do we know their motivation was wrong? V'hayinu gam anachnu kechol hagoyim. Because we want to be like all the other nations. Ushvatanu malkenu v'yatzal lefanenu milchamotenu. We want him to judge us. That's okay. And to go in front to lead us into battle. That's okay. And to fight our wars. That's okay. Gam anachnu kechol hagoyim. That's not okay. Like all the other nations. What do we sing Friday night at Kiddush? Kivanu v'charta, v'yotanu kidashta, mikol ha'amim, because he chose us from all the other nations to live the Torah life. And that sometimes is good and sometimes it's bad. Just read the daily papers, the anti-Semitism. Not only in the horrible countries where we expected, like Arab countries, Iran and Russia, old Russia, Soviet Union, and you never know when it can come back tomorrow in today's Russia or Ukraine. You never know. But even here in the United States, Harvard and MIT, Penn, Columbia, Berkeley, Stanford, I mean, everywhere, the most liberal parts of the country. And that doesn't, and don't think that the white supremacists are any better. They aren't. They've got us cooked also. And so that's the deal. We are not like all other nations. And that's, as soon as you want to be like all the other nations. So Shmuel gave them the warning. Okay. So the Gemara discusses that. The Gemara really discusses this whole idea here in Sanhedrin. The Talmud Mesekhet Sanhedrin, Daf Chaf Amud Bet, folio 20b. It's a Mishnah, Masnisim. Umotzi lemelchemet reshut al pi beistin shel shivim v'yachad uparetz lasot lo derech ve'ein mamache biyado derech hamelech ein lo shir v'chol ha'am bo zin v'not nimlo v'hu notel chelik barosh. We actually learned this all in Rambam last week, and now we go to the source. We had learned last week in Rambam. We were studying it in the Mishneh Torah, and we had learned in Mishneh Torah, to save time, I was about to read it from Mishneh Torah. I'll read it here in the Mishnah. This is not Mishneh Torah, but the source, Mishnah. The king brings out people for conscription in an optional war. We learned last week about a Milchemes Mitzvah and a Milchemes Reshus. Commanded war against the 7 nations. Also a Milchemet Mitzvah, also a commanded war is when we fight a war, a defensive war when we've been attacked. We're at peace minding our own business. We're attacked. This happened on Shabbat of Shmini Atzeret, October 7. That becomes a Milchemet Mitzvah. That's a commanded war. Jews must go out to fight, and everyone must go out to fight. Versus a Milchemet Reshut, an optional war, which is when we are at peace. We've taken over and conquered the 7 nations that we've been talking about last few weeks on Thursday nights, and Amalek and everybody, and then the king decides he wants to expand the boundaries beyond. That's an optional war. And we were starting to learn about that. Okay, so the Mishnah, the king brings out the people for an optional war on the basis of a court of 71. The king does not need any judicial authorization to declare war for a Milchemet Mitzvah. To declare that today we're going to war against the Chivi, or the Chiti, or the Yavusi, or the Girgashi, or the Perizi, any of these, the Canaani, the king simply declares war. Here, I mentioned in the United States, for example, the President of the United States does not have authority to declare war. He must get a resolution of Congress, a war resolution. Franklin Roosevelt, I mentioned in his famous speech after the Japanese bombed Pearl Harbor, that famous speech when he said December 7, 1941, a day that will live in infamy, that was part of a speech he made as he was asking Congress to pass a resolution declaring war. He did not have authority on his own to declare war. No president does, and there's a great debate going on the last 30, 40 years since Vietnam, because presidents have been kind of like pushing the boundaries of what they're really allowed to do. A lot of the wars that we've been getting into as Americans in the last half century, there's been a very, very fine line as to whether the presidents have been declaring war with proper congressional authorization. I think George W. Bush got a congressional resolution of war when they made those speeches about how Saddam Hussein with the that he I'm going blank for a moment, but he had weapons of mass destruction, and with that information that was presented to Congress, they got the declaration of war. And then, of course, there's the ongoing debate. Does that declaration from then, after 9/11, give the president today the authorization, the authority to do stuff and drop bombs in Iraq today? Like, let's say the Houthis are shooting at American vessels in the Red Sea, and the president feels that the Houthis are Iranian surrogates. So he decides, I'm going to bomb different Iranian surrogates in Iraq. And he does. Or maybe yet other Iranian surrogates bomb Americans in Jordan. So the president decides to go after Iranian surrogates in Iraq. And then the question comes, does the president have authority to bomb in Iraq? And then can he say, well, I'm doing it by virtue of the authorization from 20 years ago that was given to George W. Bush after 9/11 to go to war in Iraq? So I don't want to get too far, but I want you to see, like, that's how it's a modern thing. In Judaism, for a war against the seven nations and Amalek and a defensive war against those who attack, there's no need for authorization. The king simply declares war. But for a Milchemet Reshut, an optional war to expand the boundaries just to have a bigger country, just like this, imperialism, he needs to get permission of the Sanhedrin, of the 71 judges of the Sanhedrin. Okay, so that's a Mishnah. And then we learned in Rambam last week that we were going over the United States Constitution's Fifth Amendment, the takings clause, not the part about refusing to testify against yourself. We looked at it briefly and the rest of it, but we talked about the takings clause, that under the Fifth Amendment to the U.S. Constitution, the federal government, for example, and most states have similar rights in their constitutions to give them the right to take land, to take private property, as long as they provide just compensation. So in this Mishnah, we see that the king has the authority, a takings clause. If he goes to war, he's going to have an army of like, 100,000 chariots? I don't know. That's not just 4-lane highway. If you're thinking of a 3-lane highway or a 4-lane highway like the 405 or the FDR Drive or the Route 75 or Route 80, I mean, you're talking about how many 10 lanes, 20 lanes? I don't know. That's big. That's wide. To have a old-fashioned, like in the movie Spartacus, or these old Middle Ages England, France movies where kings come with their armies, that gives you just some idea. So he needs to make a big road. And he's allowed, according to the Mishnah. He just tears anyone's fences of anyone in the way. He bridges fences of anyone in the way to create a pathway for himself, for his various needs, and no one can protest that power. That's the ultimate takings clause. The pathway of the king has no measure. There's no limit on how wide. Like, people cannot come to court and bring like the equivalent of a motion or a complaint that the king has just made for himself a humongously wide pathway for his army to march, and now he's trying to expand even farther wide. He doesn't need all of that. Nobody's got any claim. The king can take as much land as he wants for the purpose of, say, if he simply says, he simply has to say it's to make room for his army to march, neither lengthwise nor widthwise. So, like, let's say the king of Israel wants to go into Gaza, and the trouble is only in northern Gaza, and he wants to take land up to southern Gaza. He can do whatever he wants. No one can protest, or one cannot protest. And all the people take spoils in war, and when they do go to war and they come home with spoils, they don't get to keep them straight out. You got to give your spoils to the king. He takes the first portion. Wow. And now the Gemara, as you recall, Gemara is a further discussion of what's in the Mishnah. And then Rambam's Mishneh Torah brings together the laws that are appearing in the Mishnah and those in the Gemara and those in the Chumash Navi and all the other. Gemara. We already learned this on another occasion in the Mishnah. The king may bring out the nation to an So at the beginning of Sanhedrin, we're on Sanhedrin page 20, side B. The first page of every Gemara is page 2. That's a convention. No Gemara starts on page 1. Daf Aleph, there's no Daf Aleph. It always begins with Daf Bet. Always begins with folio 2. So the very, very first Mishnah in the entire Sanhedrin begins listing a whole bunch of different things that are the power of the king. So the Gemara is first saying, why are you telling me now? I'm sorry, it talks about courts. Sanhedrin what's a Sanhedrin? Sanhedrin is like a Supreme Court, is a grand court of like 70. So the very, very first Mishnah, so I'm in 20b5. So the very first Mishnah, just so you see what I'm talking about, the very first Mishnah in Sanhedrin on page 2a, because there's no page 1, lists, and we did it last week, so I don't want to take out a lot of time, but it lists that there are certain kinds of cases, more minor cases are adjudicated by 3 judges. And we did that last week. Civil cases are before 3 judges, property cases are before 3 judges, tort cases are in front of 3 judges. And then after a while, it started listing more and more kinds of cases, all of which are done in front of 3 judges. And then it said cases of capital law are done in front of 23 judges. And then this is in front of a judge of 23 judges. That's in front of 23 judges. And then it goes on and it lists the kinds of cases that are in front of 70 judges, let's say. And then it talks about there is the Great Sanhedrin was comprised of 71. And then it gives examples of different kinds of cases that are done in front of 71. And it lists, for example, if a king wants to declare an optional war, Melchemet Reshut, he needs to go in front of 71. So the Gemara that we're at now asks a question. We already learned 19 folios ago that a king, when he wants to go with an optional war, it's done before Sanhedrin of 71. So why is it that we're learning again now 71? So the Gemara answers, before we were doing it in the context of, we already learned earlier that the king brings out the nation optional war only 71. So why is the Mishnah repeated here? So Gemara says, earlier we were turning here, in the Mishnah here, the Tanakh is teaching in terms of the powers of the king. So he's also teaching that the king has the power to bring an optional war, but he has to do it with 71. There, it was talking about which kind of cases call forth a court of 71. Okay, okay. But now let's go to why I taught to you about 1 Samuel 8. With regard to the king's powers, Amar Rav Yehuda Mar Shmuel, Rabbi Yehuda said in the name of the rabbinic scholar Shmuel, the rabbi of the town of Neher Da'ah. His name was Shmuel. He wasn't called Rav Shmuel. He was just known as Shmuel, but he was because he was even greater than the other rabbis of Neher Da'ah. Kol ha'amur b'parshat Melech Mutarbo. So the discussion is, you know what I just began class with today? Chapter 8 of 1 Samuel, Shmuel Aleph, where Shmuel was warning the people, your king is going to take your land and take your flocks. He's going to take your sons and daughters. He's going to make them bakers and perfumers, and he's going to put them in chariots. And he's going to take your farms, and he's going to take your lands. So the debate is, was Samuel, was prophet, was Navi, was the Shmuel Hanavi, was the prophet Samuel listing for the people halacha, God's law, that these formally are the powers of the king? Or is he just trying to scare the daylights out of them? Like, it shouldn't be taken literally that the king's going to do that, but he wanted them not to ask for a king, so he was trying to scare the wits out of them. He wasn't lying. Yeah, a king out of control could do that, but really a king won't do that. Or was he saying that goes part and parcel with having a king? So that's the debate in the Gemara. And that's going to have an impact on whether the king can force everybody to go to war, which has an impact on Jewish concept of war. Rav Yehuda says, that Shmuel says, concerning all the actions that are stated in that biblical passage, the warning of Samuel, it is permitted for a king to perform them. Rav. Now, Rav was the other great rabbi of Shmuel's generation. Shmuel was the great rabbi of the Jewish community of Neher Da'ah in Babylonia, and Rav was the chief rabbi of the Jewish community of Surah. And at that time, those were the two great Torah communities in Babylonia. So we often have disputes between Rav and Shmuel, the way in our modern era we might have a dispute between the Ashkenazic chief rabbi of Israel and the Sephardic chief rabbi of Israel. On 99% of issues, the two chief rabbis agree. You only hear about it when they disagree on something. Same thing, Rav and Shmuel agree 99% of the things. Shabbat is on Saturday and pork is not kosher. I mean, what's the question? How many days to Sukkot? I mean, everybody agrees. But there are certain fine points where they would disagree, just as in the modern era, as I said, the Ashkenazic chief rabbi, Rav Lau, and the Sephardic chief rabbi, HaChacham Rav Yosef, might disagree. So where Shmuel said, as quoted by Rav Yehuda, that the prophet was listing things permitted for a king, okay, Rav says that passage was stated only to threaten them. He doesn't literally have that power, but it's to scare the daylights out of them. Okay, he wanted so that they would accept the king's sovereignty with reverence. Okay, so it's necessary the fear should be on them, but the king is not actually permitted to perform them. So Rav says the king can't literally take your daughter and make her a baker or a perfumer. The king cannot literally just seize every piece of land and take your vineyards and give it. The king can't literally do it. And Shmuel says, yeah, the king literally can. Gemara comments that this dispute is parallel to a dispute between two other rabbis, as it says in the Breita. Rabbi Yossi says, concerning all the actions stated in the biblical passage about the king, it is permitted for a king to perform them. And Rabbi Yossi and Rabbi Yehuda have the same dispute that later Rav and Shmuel would have. Rabbi Yehuda says this biblical passage was stated only in order to threaten the people. Same thing. V'chein haya Rav Yehuda omer. And the Braita continues, and so would Rabbi Yehuda say, 3 mitzvot were commanded to the Jewish people upon their entrance into Eretz Yisrael. And these apply only in Eretz Yisrael. The Jews were, after all, receiving 613 commandments in the Torah while they were wandering in the desert of Sinai. And they were getting 613 commandments. Only 3 of those commandments were priority 1. As soon as you get into the land of Israel, this comes before everything else. Look, if you can't do it, you can't do it, if it's impracticable. But if there's any way for you to do it, you don't put it off. These are the first 3 things to do, or at least as soon as you can. They were commanded to establish a king for themselves. So we see they didn't. They came in, they were led by Yehoshua, Joshua. Later, they were led by a whole bunch of different shoftim judges. Some of the more famous ones were Gidon, Devorah, Yiftach, Shimshon, others, many others. And then came Nevi'im. There was Shmuel. And then finally a king. So they didn't do it right away. But they were commanded. That's something you don't do in America. You don't do it in the desert. But when you enter the land of Israel, you will have a king over yourselves and nowhere else. So let's say the Jews of Borough Park cannot announce that Borough Park, Brooklyn is so Jewish, we're going to have a king. Or when the Jews in the Warsaw Ghetto, long before, or other ghettos, when Jews were in peacetime, when Jews had their own ghettos, but it was peaceable, and they did not make a king over themselves. That's only in Eretz Yisrael. Second of all, to cut off Amalek. You can't go around Brooklyn killing people saying, I'm fulfilling the mitzvah of Amalek. You can't go around doing that. Only in Eretz Yisrael does that mitzvah apply. And we saw it applied when King Shaul became the king. He had to do it. He was commanded. David, we just learned this Tuesday night, how David killed the Amalekite. He was an Amalekite. So it applies in Eretz Yisrael. And to build a Beis HaMikdash. You don't build a Beis HaMikdash in Brooklyn. You don't build not even Williamsburg, or you don't convert 770 Eastern Parkway to a Beis HaMikdash. Only in Eretz Yisrael can there be a Beis HaMikdash, and only in Yerushalayim, and only on the mounts, on Har Zion, on the Temple Mount. Okay. So, the Brisa continues. Rabbi Nahari says, this biblical passage about appointing a king was stated only in response to the Jewish people's complaint. As it is stated, let's just see I'm sorry, the bar just came up because somebody just is getting back. Okay. So, this particular passage is stated, as far as naming a king, only in response to the Jewish people's complaint. As it says in Devarim, because I've been quoting from the Pasuk in Devarim, Perek Yud Zayin Pasuk Yudalad, chapter 17, verse 14, Ki tavo el ha'aretz asher Hashem Elokecha noten lach, when you will enter the land of Israel that God gives you, v'rishta v'shavta ba, and you finally will inherit all of it. So in other words, not right away, you've got to drive out the other nations and inherit the land, not just be there and dwell there. And then v'yasat v'yamarta v'asim alai melech k'chol goyim asher svivotai som tasim alecha melech asher yivchar Hashem Elokecha bo, etc., etc. And you have all these laws. Has to be somebody who's born Jewish, similar to the United States. You know, if you're an American, like Henry Kissinger, when he was the hottest thing in town during the Nixon years, whether you like him or not, I don't want to get into it. But there was a point where Kissinger was the only political figure of any authority in the country as Nixon was going down with Watergate. And some people said, gee, maybe maybe Kissinger, he should be up there for president. Or there was a brief moment in time when Schwarzenegger got elected governor of California in the very, very, very beginning. He also was the hottest thing in town. So people said, what a shame he can't be president. And the thing is, Schwarzenegger was born in Austria and Kissinger was born in Germany, so not eligible, no matter how patriotically American they are. Under the Torah law, A person has to be born Jewish to be king. A convert could never become king of Israel, even though he could be or she could be the greatest Jew ever, ever, ever. Like Ruth, there's a book of the Torah named, a book of the Bible named Tanakh named for Ruth. And she's the progenitor of David HaMelech. But certain people cannot be king. Okay. So getting back to this, so we were just learning here in the Gemara. Oops. Do I still have the Gemara? Did I lose the page? And if I lost the page, it's all for the best. Just see, 1 second. If not, I'll just go forward. There we are. So back to this, back to what we're learning here. So we're learning here we're learning in Sanhedrin about the place and the authority of the king of Israel. And as we're learning this, we're seeing that Rabbi Yehuda said there are 3 things that when you come to Eretz Yisrael, you name a king, you'll cut off a Amalek, and you'll build a Beis HaMikdash. And he cites Devarim, I just brought it up for you, that when you come into the land, you'll have a king. Okay. So it's taught in a brisa. And this is what I was teaching you, but here's my source. I didn't make it up, and I'm not so smart. Rather, I shared with you what I learned in the Gemara. Rabbi Elazar says, the elders of Shmuel's generation asked appropriately, that is the Zakanim, Hanya Rabbi Eliezer, Omer, Rabbi Tanya, it was learned in a brisa. Rabbi Eliezer Omer, Rabbi Eliezer said, Zakanim Shebador, the Zakains, the Zakanim, the religious leaders, the elders, not elders by virtue of being over 70 or 80, but the religious leaders, they of Shmuel's generation, Kehogen Sha'alu, asked in an appropriate way, Shnemar, as it says in chapter 8, verse 6, Tana lanu melech lishvatenu, please give us a king to be our new judge. It was understood Shmuel's sons would not be worthy. There would be a vacuum. The elders said it's time to invoke the monarchy clause of the Torah. Aval ame ha'aretz shebahen hilkalu. Unfortunately, the masses among the Jews of that time screwed it up. Shnemar, as it says later, V'hayinu gam anachnu kechol hagoyim, v'shafatnu malkeinu v'yatzal lefanenu. They screwed up. The ignoramuses among them ruined it. It was fine to ask for a king. The Torah made allowance for it. But then they came and said that we may be like all the nations, as I taught you at the beginning of class. That's my source. So therefore, Tanya, it was taught. And this is identical, so I won't repeat it again. Sometimes the Gemara brings the same teaching a second time. And here, the Gemara says, which is first? So I was taught, when we come into the land of Israel, there are 3 things we should do. Name a king, wipe out Amalek, and build a Beis HaMikdash. Which is first? And they discuss it. You might ask yourself, what do you think is first? Name a king. I would think name a king is first. To build a Beis HaMikdash, you need a leader to supervise and over. I would think, well, you're going to have to name a king eventually. Probably the king will supervise that. And as far as killing Amalek, if you don't have a king, you'll have chaos. And you'll have every guy with a sword going around killing people. And as we know happens with people, they end up killing the wrong guy. And that's what anarchy is. And that's why we have police, and that's why we have law enforcement and proper authorities to conduct law and order. Because if everyone takes the law in their own hands, you end up with a lot of innocent people getting killed by vigilantes, which is not a good thing. And so the Gemara discusses it. And I'm not going to take out all the time on it. I just wanted to share the question with you and show you it's an interesting discussion, that